Welcome to Boring Pastimes, where history slows down and unfolds in quiet detail. Tonight, we journey through forgotten corners of the past where ordinary lives, small decisions, and unseen struggles shaped the world in ways both subtle and profound. Settle in, let the stories carry you back, and drift into the calm rhythm of history, told not with drama, but with patience. This is history for sleep, reflection, and the simple passage of time. Story 1. Life in a speakeasy of 1920s Chicago. When you imagine 1920s Chicago, perhaps your mind drifts first to images of men in pinstriped suits, wide-brimmed fedoras, and the shadow of organized crime. But to enter into the true daily rhythm of this era, you have to begin at an unmarked door. The story of a speakeasy does not start with champagne bubbles or jazz, but with something much more ordinary and inconvenient: the fear of being caught during prohibition. From 1920 to 1933, the United States attempted a social experiment unlike any before, by banning the sale, transport, and manufacture of alcohol. Lawmakers hoped to tame drunkenness, strengthen family life, and improve public morals. What actually happened was something very different. For the ordinary Chicagoan who simply wanted a beer after a long day of work, it meant searching for places that were never supposed to exist. The term speakeasy itself comes from the idea of speaking quietly, of lowering your voice so as not to draw attention. Imagine yourself walking along a narrow alley in Chicago in the year 1925. You know the address only because a friend told you, and even then, you double-check the street signs. The outside of the building looks plain, just brick with a wooden door. Maybe a faded advertisement for a tailor or a second-hand shop. You walk up, knock once, and wait. A small peephole slides open. A pair of eyes studies you. You give the password. Sometimes it is something simple, like "Joe sent me." Sometimes it changes every night, and you have to be sure you remembered it exactly. If you are wrong, you will be turned away. If you are right, the door opens, and you step inside into a different world. But before we step into that world, it is worth pausing. Think for a moment about the countless steps that had to happen before you could enter. The brewery or distillery that made the liquor had to operate illegally. Farmers may have sold grain or fruit with the knowledge that it would be turned into moonshine. Truck drivers risked arrest transporting barrels across state lines. In some cases, alcohol was smuggled across the Canadian border or by sea from Europe. By the time the glass touched your lips in Chicago, the liquid had already passed through dozens of careful, often dangerous hands. The speakeasy was more than just a place to drink. It was a survival mechanism. For working men and women, it was a way to reclaim normal life in the face of laws that disrupted daily habits. For musicians, bartenders, and waitstaff, it meant employment when legitimate opportunities dried up. For criminals, it meant money, steady, flowing, irresistible money. Inside, the speakeasy had its own atmosphere. The first thing you would notice was the lighting. Rooms were often dim, not only to set a mood, but also to prevent police or outsiders from seeing too clearly through windows or doors. Smoke from cigars hung in the air, catching what little light there was. The sound of music, often jazz, sometimes a simple piano, floated through the room. The decor varied wildly. Some speakeasies were lavish, decorated like the finest hotels. with velvet curtains and polished wood bars. Others were plain, little more than basements with mismatched furniture. In Chicago, both existed side by side, depending on who ran the place. Some were directly tied to organized crime bosses, with profits funneling upward into large syndicates. Others were family-run neighborhood affairs, relying on local customers and a bit of luck to stay unnoticed. Imagine the drink menu. There was rarely wine or carefully aged whiskey. Instead, you might be offered a gin Ricky, a cocktail designed to disguise the harsh taste of homemade gin, or perhaps a bathtub gin fizz, named quite literally because some of the alcohol was mixed in bathtubs at home. Ice was a luxury, and garnishes were meant to cover flaws. People drank not for taste, but for the small rebellion it represented. The patrons were equally diverse. You might see young men in cheap suits sitting beside women dressed in the flapper fashion of the time, with bobbed hair and beaded dresses. In the more upscale places, business leaders and politicians sat quietly in the corner, hoping not to be noticed but enjoying the thrill nonetheless. At its core, the speakeasy was one of the few places in 1920s America where social boundaries blurred. Still, the risk was always there. Police raids were common, though often ineffective. Many officers were bribed to look the other way, and others were directly on the payroll of gangsters like Al Capone. But for the average customer, there was always a small chance that the night could end in chaos, with shouts, running feet, and the clatter of broken glass as the establishment was stormed. And yet, people kept coming back. Why? Because the speakeasy offered more than drink. It offered belonging. It offered escape from the monotony of work and the strictness of home. It offered, in its own quiet and illegal way, a piece of freedom as you sit with your drink in hand. The piano player tapping out a rhythm in the corner, you cannot help but wonder, was the risk worth it? Was this dimly lit room, with its laughter and smoke, truly better than the sober but legal world outside? Or was it only an illusion, fragile and temporary, waiting to collapse at the sound of a police whistle? Once you were past the door, past the nervous thrill of giving the password and being admitted, the speakeasy revealed itself as a world with its own set of rules. If Section 1 was about the doorway, the threshold between the legal and the forbidden, Section 2 is about what happened once you crossed it. The first thing that settled into your body was the rhythm. Not just the rhythm of music, though that was there, pulsing from corner stages and small dance floors, but the rhythm of life unfolding at a different pace than the world outside. Time in a speakeasy seemed to move slower, less structured. The clock on the wall might tick toward midnight, but conversation stretched without urgency. Laughter rolled out of smoky corners, and the flow of drinks set its own tempo. For many, this rhythm was as important as the alcohol. Work in Chicago was hard and often unforgiving. The city was alive with factories, stockyards, steel mills, and railways. The working day was noisy, dangerous, and exhausting. To step into the speakeasy was to enter a softer place. Here, people's movements were guided not by machinery or schedules, but by the music and by each other. The music itself was a revelation. Chicago in the 1920s was one of the great homes of jazz, a sound carried north by African American musicians. During the Great Migration, families who had left the oppression of the South brought with them traditions of blues, gospel and brass, weaving them into something new. In speakeasies, jazz bands found steady work, even if the pay was uncertain and the hours long. Imagine a small stage in the corner, a trumpet gleaming in the dim light, a clarinet weaving notes around a rolling piano. The drummer keeps time with brushes soft enough not to overpower conversation. Couples dance, their steps small because the floor is crowded, but their faces light up as the rhythm carries them. For many patrons, this was the first time they encountered jazz directly, and it became inseparable from the very idea of the 1920s itself. Bartenders were another essential part of the rhythm. These men and women worked under constant pressure, not only mixing drinks, but doing so with speed, charm, and discretion. They often doubled as guards of the room, watching for strangers who might be police or informants. Many bartenders were skilled improvisers, able to turn poor-quality alcohol into something drinkable with syrups, fruit juice, or soda water. Their craft was less about precision than survival. Behind the bar, bottles were often unlabeled or reused. Alcohol might come from local moonshiners or from larger operations tied to crime syndicates. A bartender had to know the supply chain, if only to reassure regulars that tonight's batch wouldn't make them ill. In a world where some homemade liquor contained dangerous levels of methanol, trust in the bartender was a matter of safety. The waitstaff, too, played their role, moving through crowded tables, balancing trays, and dodging dancers. They were the invisible glue that kept the operation running. For many women, waitressing in a speakeasy was one of the few ways to earn independent income, though it came with risks and wanted attention, irregular pay, and the chance of being caught in a raid. Still, for some, the job carried a sense of pride. They were part of a hidden world that most outsiders only whispered about. Then there were the regulars. Every speakeasy had them, the people who came so often that they almost blended into the walls. Some were workers from nearby factories who needed release after grueling shifts. Some were students, teachers, or clerks seeking excitement in an otherwise orderly life. Others were small-time gamblers, hustlers, or even members of rival gangs, careful to keep a low profile in upscale speakeasies. Regulars could include politicians, police officers, or wealthy businessmen. They came not because they lacked alcohol, most could afford private supplies, but because the speakeasy offered something more intoxicating than liquor: secrecy. To sit in a hidden room, to share laughter and music in defiance of the law, gave even the most respectable man a taste of rebellion. Of course, not everyone who entered was welcome. The managers and doormen kept careful watch. A careless guest could bring disaster. Someone too loud, too reckless, or too eager to brag about the location could invite raids. In this way, speakeasies became communities bound not just by pleasure, but by trust. The risk of exposure forced people to rely on one another, to share responsibility for the room's survival. This trust extended to performers as well. A singer might belt out a blues number, her voice rising above clinking glasses, while the pianist followed her with easy familiarity. Patrons leaned in, some quieting to listen, others letting the music blur into the background of their conversations. The beauty of these performances was often that they were ephemeral. Songs were rarely recorded, arrangements shifted night by night, and yet the memory lingered long after the final note. Still, beneath the rhythm of music and laughter, another rhythm pulsed, the rhythm of danger. It was there, in the sideways glances toward the door, in the hush that fell when someone unexpected entered, in the occasional need to hide bottles at a moment's notice. Police raids were not everyday events, but they were frequent enough that the possibility shaped every night. And then there was the larger, unspoken rhythm of crime. Chicago's speakeasies did not exist in isolation. They were connected to a web of suppliers, gangsters, and protection rackets. Some owners paid directly to crime bosses for the privilege of staying open. Others relied on bribes to local police or officials. In either case, the money that passed over the bar was only part of the story. Beneath each transaction lay invisible lines of power and control, reaching far beyond the walls of the speakeasy itself. It is this dual rhythm, the carefree music and laughter on the surface, the constant undercurrent of risk below that defined the speakeasy experience. Patrons lived within both, often choosing to ignore the darker beat in favor of the lighter one. But the two were inseparable as the night wore on. As the smoke grew thicker and the band shifted into faster tempos, one could not help but wonder, how long could this balance last? How long could these hidden rooms exist, dancing between joy and danger, before the weight of law and violence forced them into silence? By the time dawn crept into Chicago's streets, the speakeasy emptied. Patrons staggered home through alleys, careful to avoid police patrols, while bartenders scrubbed down tables and musicians packed their instruments. The hidden room returned to silence, but even in silence, its significance lingered. For many, it had been more than a place to drink. It had been a second home, a place where identities shifted, where people felt freer than in their everyday lives. And yet, nothing in the 1920s was permanent. The Prohibition era was itself temporary, though it did not feel that way to those living through it. For more than a decade, Americans wrestled with the contradictions of a law that was widely ignored, yet strictly enforced. Speakeasies became a symbol of those contradictions. They flourished in secrecy, but their very existence reminded everyone that the state's attempt to control behavior had failed. Chicago's speakeasies carried a particular weight in this story. The city was not only a hub of commerce and industry, but also one of the most notorious centers of organized crime. Figures like Al Capone became household names, not just because of violence, but because their power depended on alcohol. Speakeasies were their lifeblood, channels through which illegal liquor flowed like rivers. The violence tied to these establishments was never far from the surface. Gang wars erupted over territory, supply routes, and control of speakeasy. Shootings and bombings claimed lives, sometimes of rivals, sometimes of innocent bystanders. For the average customer, sipping a cocktail in a dimly lit room, these events might feel distant, but the money they spent on watered-down gin connected directly to a network of crime that stretched across the city. Still, speakeasies were not only about crime, they were also about culture. Jazz, which filled their smoky rooms, spread from Chicago to the wider nation, shaping the sound of a generation. Women who entered speakeasies as flappers challenged expectations about femininity and social roles. Interracial mixing, though limited and often fraught with tension, occurred more in speakeasies than in many other public spaces of the era, in their own quiet way. These hidden rooms pushed the boundaries of American society. By the late 1920s, cracks in prohibition were obvious. Public opinion shifted. Even politicians who had once supported the ban admitted its failures, or crime thrived instead of disappearing. Tax revenues from alcohol had vanished, while government spending on enforcement soared. For ordinary citizens, the ban no longer felt like a moral safeguard, but like an inconvenience that corrupted everything it touched. When prohibition finally ended in 1933 with the passage of the 21st Amendment, the speakeasies began to vanish. Some transformed into legitimate bars and nightclubs, shedding secrecy but keeping music and laughter alive. Others disappeared altogether, their addresses forgotten, their walls crumbling back into obscurity. A few lived on in memory, romanticized as glamorous dens of rebellion, though the reality had often been far less elegant for those who had lived through it. The end of prohibition was both a relief and a loss. Relief because the fear of raids, arrests, and bad liquor was over. Loss because something of the hidden world was gone. The sense of belonging that came from whispering a password, the thrill of stepping through an unmarked door, the strange intimacy of sharing risk with strangers. Even today, when you walk through certain neighborhoods of Chicago, you may pass buildings that once housed speakeasies. Most carry no markers of their past. A plain brick wall, a narrow alley, an ordinary shopfront. Behind these, once upon a time, people gathered in defiance of the law. Their laughter rose, their glasses clinked, and their music spilled out into a city that tried, unsuccessfully, to silence them. In the end, the story of the speakeasy is not only about alcohol, it is about resilience, the human tendency to seek connection, joy, and community, even when rules forbid it. It is about the limits of control, the way laws can bend but not fully break daily habits. And it is about memory, how places designed to be temporary, secret, and fragile can still leave a lasting imprint on culture. So when you imagine that unmarked doorway once again, when you hear the echo of jazz drifting from behind it, you might ask yourself, what other hidden corners of history still shape the world you live in, even if their walls have long since disappeared? Story 2. Medieval heating, from hearth fires to braziers. When you picture a medieval home in winter, you might imagine smoke curling upward, the glow of a fire against stone walls, and a family gathered for warmth. But the reality of medieval heating was not so romantic. For most people, fire was less a comfort than a fragile defense against the cold. The hearth, the open fire at the center of a home, was both a necessity and a burden, a place where warmth and hardship lived. Side by side, to begin with, medieval houses were rarely designed for comfort. Peasant homes were simple wooden or wattle-and daub structures with thatched roofs and packed earth floors. Stone houses were sturdier, but they were cold, their walls retaining dampness. Windows were small and often covered with oiled cloth, rather than glass, letting in dim light but little warmth. Insulation, as we think of it today, did not exist. When winter winds swept through Europe, the walls and roofs of these homes offered only partial protection. At the center of this world stood the hearth, typically just an open fire built on a flat stone or clay base. The hearth was the single source of heat in most homes. It provided warmth, light, and a place to cook food. Families gathered around it, not only to stay warm, but also to share meals and conversation. In many ways, the hearth defined the shape of daily life. Its smoke curled upward, sometimes escaping through a hole in the roof, sometimes filling the room before it slowly drifted out. The smell of smoke clung to clothing, to walls, and to the very fabric of life. The work of tending the fire fell to everyone. Children gathered sticks, women collected peat or dung, men chopped larger logs. Fire was not guaranteed, it had to be carefully preserved. Letting it go out on a freezing night could mean hours of work to rekindle it. In some villages, neighbors shared hot embers, carrying them in clay pots from one hearth to another to restart flames. The fire was fragile, but it was also sacred. Its endurance tied to the endurance of the family itself. In wealthier homes, the hearth took different forms. Great halls in castles and manor houses had enormous open fires, their smoke rising into rafters and drifting out through louvered openings in the roof. These halls could hold dozens, even hundreds of people, yet they were still drafty and cold. Only those who sat near the fire truly felt its warmth. Servants and guests farther away wrapped themselves in cloaks, their breath visible in the chill. Even kings and lords, surrounded by luxury, lived in a world where cold pressed constantly at the edges of comfort. Clothing was as important as fire. Layered wool, furs, and heavy cloaks were the true shields against winter. The hearth, a small circle of warmth, but outside that circle, the air remained icy. Families often slept close together, not only for companionship, but for heat. Beds were piled with blankets or straw, and animals were sometimes brought indoors to add their body warmth to the household. Fuel was always a concern. Wood was the most common source of heat, but it was not always available. In areas where forests had been cut back, peasants relied on peat, dried animal dung, or bundles of brush. Gathering fuel was time-consuming and exhausting, especially in snow or rain. Wealthier households consumed enormous quantities of wood, their demand contributing to deforestation in parts of Europe. The question of how to keep the fire burning was a constant one, shaping daily routines and seasonal rhythms. The hearth also carried risks. Fires could easily spread, especially in houses with thatched roofs and wooden beams. Entire villages sometimes went up in flames because of a single spark. Smoke inhalation was another hazard. Without chimneys, which did not become common until the later Middle Ages, smoke-filled rooms and irritated lungs and eyes. For many, watery eyes and persistent coughs were part of daily life, the price of staying warm. And yet, the hearth was more than a burden. It was a place of symbolism. In many cultures, it was seen as the spiritual center of the home, a place where ancestors were honored and hospitality was extended. To offer someone a place by the fire was to welcome them into one's household. To sit together in its glow was to share not only warmth, but also trust. On long winter nights, stories were told by the hearth. Songs were sung, prayers recited, and silence kept as flames flickered and shadows danced on walls. For children, it was the place where they learned lessons from elders. For parents, it was the place where they measured the health and survival of their family. The hearth was not just a tool, it was the heart And so, as you imagine the medieval hearth, ask yourself, how did people endure such cold with so little protection? What did it mean to build life around a fragile circle of warmth, where the smallest flame held back the vast, unrelenting winter? The hearth might have been the center of medieval life, but it was never enough. Even when flames leaped high, the heat they produced spread unevenly, leaving most of a room chilled. This was especially true in larger buildings, manor houses, monasteries, and castles where vast stone walls swallowed warmth as quickly as it was made. To live in such places was to live in constant negotiation with the cold, finding small ways to resist its persistence. One of the simplest solutions was the brazier. A brazier was a portable container, usually made of metal, in which hot coals burned. Unlike a hearth fixed to one location, a brazier could be carried from room to room. It was common in wealthier households, where servants could fetch embers from the main fire and place them in a brazier to warm a chamber, a corridor, or even a chapel. But braziers carried their own dangers. Without proper ventilation, the smoke and fumes from charcoal could be deadly, leading to suffocation. Historical accounts mention sudden deaths that were likely caused by carbon monoxide poisoning, though the people of the time did not understand the cause. To use a brazier was to risk unseen danger for the sake of temporary comfort. Monasteries faced similar challenges. Monks rose early for prayers, often in unheated stone churches where winter air lingered even in the nave. Their daily lives were governed by discipline, not luxury, and heating was limited. Scriptoria, where monks copied manuscripts, were sometimes given small braziers or stoves to protect delicate fingers from freezing. But even so, many manuscripts show uneven writing, where cold stiffened the hands of their creators. The labor of preserving knowledge was often done with breath visible in the frigid air. The arrival of the chimney marked a slow revolution. Before chimneys, smoke from a hearth simply rose into rafters and escaped through holes in the roof or gaps in walls. This filled rooms with soot and left beams blackened with years of exposure. The development of chimneys in the later Middle Ages changed this dynamic. They allowed smoke to be funneled outside while keeping more heat in. Rooms could finally be built with multiple floors, since fire could be safely vented through walls, instead of only from an open roof. Yet chimneys spread slowly. They were expensive to build and maintain, requiring skilled masons. Only the wealthiest households could afford them at first, and even then, they were often limited to a single chimney, serving multiple fireplaces. For most people, the hearth remained the standard, with smoke and all its discomforts lingering well into the late medieval period. Furniture, too, adapted to the cold. High-backed wooden chairs were designed to block drafts, creating pockets of warmth around the sitter. Beds became more elaborate, with curtains that could be drawn to trap body heat during the night. In wealthier homes, feather mattresses, furs, and thick wool blankets created warmth within a small cocoon, even when the rest of the room was icy. For peasants, straw mattresses and patched wool blankets served the same purpose, though far less effectively. Clothing functioned as a form of heating technology. Layered wool tunics, stockings, and cloaks were worn indoors as well as outdoors. Hats and hoods were common even at the hearth, since much of the body's heat escapes from the head. Gloves or mittens were worn, not just outside, but while working, in workshops, barns, or even at writing desks. To remove too many layers indoors would have been unthinkable during winter months. Fuel scarcity shaped everything. In towns and cities, wood had to be brought in from surrounding countryside, raising prices. Peasants living on marginal land often relied on peat cut from bogs, dried animal dung, or bundles of twigs and brush. These fuels burned with less heat and more smoke, but they were available. The question of fuel was a daily calculation. How much to burn now for warmth, and how much to save for the days still ahead. Some regions developed unique solutions. In Scandinavia, where winters were particularly harsh, houses were often built partly into the ground, or with thick turf walls for insulation. In the Mediterranean, where winters were milder, braziers remained the main method of heating. In mountainous areas, herders sometimes kept animals in lower levels of houses, with their body heat rising upward to warm living spaces above. Despite all these adaptations, cold remained a constant companion. Letters, chronicles, and household records from the period speak of bitter winters when rivers froze, crops failed, and people struggled to survive. In the winter of 1315, during the Great Famine, accounts describe families huddling together for warmth as food and fuel both ran short. Cold was not simply uncomfortable, it was a force that shaped survival, economy, and even mortality. Still, people endured. They adapted through layers of clothing, shared fires, and modest innovations. Warmth was always fleeting, never complete, but it was enough to sustain life. And so the question lingers: if the hearth was the heart, and the brazier the extension of that heart, what would it mean when entire buildings, castles, monasteries, cities began to shift their very architecture to fight the cold? The story of medieval heating is, at its core, the story of adaptation. People did not have central heating systems, radiators, or thermostats. They lived in a world where warmth was uneven, fragile, and fleeting. But that very fragility left a deep imprint on the way medieval society developed, from the design of buildings to the habits of families and the cycles of work. Architecture, for one, was shaped profoundly by the need to conserve heat. In early medieval houses, a single large room centered on the hearth was the norm. Everyone, family members, servants, even animals, shared that same space. Over time, as chimneys and fireplaces spread, homes could be divided into separate rooms without filling them all with smoke. This allowed for privacy, but it also reinforced social hierarchies. The lords' chambers, with their own fireplaces, were warmer, while servants still shivered in unheated corners. Warmth became a sign of status. The same was true in monasteries. The calefactory, literally the warming room, was often the only heated space in a monastic complex. Monks could gather there briefly to thaw their fingers before returning to prayer, study, or labor. Access to warmth was not taken for granted. It was rationed, regulated, and tied to the spiritual discipline of enduring hardship. Heat was a luxury, and enduring cold was seen by some as a form of piety. Public buildings reflected similar concerns. Guild halls, town halls, and law courts were often vast, echoing spaces with central hearths. Participants gathered near the fire if they could, but much of the room remained cold. Winter proceedings were shortened, and many civic functions slowed in the harshest months. Even politics bent to the cold. Clothing and food served as extensions of heating. Heavy cloaks, woolen hose, fur linings, and layered tunics turned bodies into moving hearths. Soups, porridges, and stews warmed not only stomachs but also hands as people cradled wooden bowls by the fire. Drinking warm ale or mulled wine was not simply pleasure but practicality, a way to feel temporary relief against icy drafts. The rhythms of daily life shifted with the seasons. In winter, workdays were shorter, not only because of fewer daylight hours, but because of the physical limits imposed by cold. Farmers repaired tools indoors rather than working fields. Weavers, spinners, and smiths clustered around fires when possible. In towns, trades slowed. The cold was not an interruption, but a season in itself, demanding endurance and patience. Yet heating was never just about survival, was also about community. Families gathered by the hearth not only to warm their bodies, but to strengthen bonds. Stories, songs, prayers, and silences shared in firelight became part of cultural memory. Even in castles, where lords held feasts in great halls, the roaring fire at one end was as much a stage for fellowship as it was a source of heat. Fire created spaces where people came together, even if only for a short reprieve from the cold pressing outside. There was also the constant tension between warmth and danger. Fires that sustained life could just as easily destroy it. Medieval chronicles recount devastating blazes that consumed entire towns, sparked by stray embers or overturned braziers. Insurance did not exist. A fire could erase lifetimes of work. In hours, villagers rebuilt with what they had, often repeating the same vulnerable designs. Fire was a companion, but also a threat, and living with both sides of its nature was unavoidable by the late Middle Ages, as chimneys became more common and fuel sources expanded. Heating slowly grew more reliable. But the deep habits of life, shaped by the struggle against cold, did not vanish. Even with better fireplaces, people still layered their clothing, huddled together at night, and measured winters in terms of endurance. The legacy of medieval heating can still be traced today. The phrase hearth and home lingers in language as a symbol of domestic life. Many European cities still preserve medieval buildings with soot-darkened beams that once bore the marks of open fires. And the cultural memory of fire as the heart of the household continues, even in an age of furnaces and electricity. To live in the medieval world was to live with the knowledge that warmth was temporary, conditional, and precious. It was never guaranteed. The hearth, the brazier, and later the chimney were not just technologies, they were lifelines. They made survival possible. They shaped the spaces where people gathered, and they left an imprint on culture that lasted long after the smoke had cleared. And so the story of medieval heating leaves us with a question. In a world where warmth is now as easy as turning a dial, what have we lost of that deep awareness, the sense that fire itself, fragile and flickering, once stood between survival and the cold silence of winter? Story 3. The long wait for bread. Food shortages in the Middle Ages. When you imagine a medieval feast, perhaps you picture long wooden tables, candles flickering, trenchers of bread overflowing with roasted meats, and mugs of ale passed between. laughing companions. But those scenes of plenty were not the daily reality for most people. For the majority of men, women, and children living in medieval Europe, bread was not just foodie, was survival. And yet, bread was often scarce. The story of medieval bread is not one of abundance, but of waiting. Waiting for grain to ripen in the fields, waiting for flour at the mill, waiting for loaves from the bakehouse, waiting when the harvest failed. When granaries emptied, when storms or frost or blight meant that bread, the daily staple, became uncertain. The rhythm of hunger was not constant famine, but cycles of lean times that pressed hardest just before the harvest, when last year's stores had run thin and the new crop was not yet ready. Bread was central because it was versatile, filling, and above all, reliable when grain was available. Rye, barley, oats, and wheat were turned into loaves that sustained life in every region. In wealthier households, white wheat bread was prized. For the poor, coarse, dark loaves made with rye, bran, or even beans and acorns in desperate times were the norm. Every mouthful mattered. In villages, women rose early to prepare dough, kneading coarse flour mixed with water, yeast, and sometimes salt if it was available. But not every household had an oven. In fact, most did not. Baking often took place in communal ovens run by lords, monasteries, or towns, where families paid fees in grain or coin to bake their loaves. That meant bread was not simply food, it was a system, a structure, a symbol of authority. Lords could restrict access to mills and ovens, controlling who ate and when. Waiting for bread was waiting for permission. Hunger sharpened in what people called the hungry gap, the stretch between spring and midsummer, when winter stores ran out. Families diluted flour with ground-up peas, lentils, or weeds to stretch what remained. Thin pottage simmered over hearths, more water than grain, flavored with whatever greens could be foraged. Children went to bed with aching stomachs, and adults rose in the night, restless with hunger that bread alone might ease. In towns, bread shortages caused tension that could spill into unrest. Bakers accused of hoarding or short-weight loaves were punished harshly. Some were pilloried in the marketplace, their bread confiscated. Others faced riots when hungry crowds demanded fair prices. The assize of bread, like England, attempted to regulate bread's price and weight according to the cost of grain. Yet even laws could not conjure wheat in years of poor harvests. Waiting for bread could become a matter of survival, a fragile hope balanced on the weather, the soil, and the politics of grain trade. And so, the medieval hearth was often a place of longing rather than plenty. Families sat by the fire, not with feasts, but with fragments half a loaf shared, crusts softened in broth, crumbs gathered and treasured. To eat was to endure, to wait was to survive. But what happened when the wait grew too long, when hunger turned into true famine? How did communities cope when bread, the very foundation of their diet, all but disappeared? When hunger deepened into famine, the wait for bread was no longer measured in hours or days, but in seasons, even years. Medieval Europe experienced repeated famines, with some of the most devastating striking in the early 14th century. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, triggered by relentless rains, crop failures, and livestock disease, was perhaps the most infamous, but across centuries, localized shortages struck again and again, woven into the rhythm of medieval life. Bread, so central to survival, became scarce to the point of impossibility. When grain stores ran empty, communities turned to substitutes. Loaves were padded with less nourishing ingredients, ground peas, vetch, even tree bark, in desperate circumstances. In some records, we hear of famine bread, dark and bitter, made from acorns or weeds, harsh on the stomach but barely keeping life in the body. These substitutions had consequences. The ergot fungus, which thrived on rye in damp years, sometimes poisoned entire villages. Known as St. Anthony's fire, ergotism caused hallucinations, convulsions, and even death. Yet hungry people consumed what they had, gambling survival against poisoning. The risk was grim but familiar. Communities leaned on one another, but help was not always enough. Monasteries distributed alms, offering bread and pottage to the poor, but supplies ran thin quickly. Lords, too, sometimes opened their granaries to tenants, though at other times they hoarded grain, hoping to profit from higher prices. Markets, usually bustling with loaves, became tense and empty. Bread riots erupted when desperate townsfolk accused bakers and merchants of hiding supplies. The famine years left deep scars. Chroniclers describe fields lying fallow, livestock carcasses left unburied, families wandering from village to village in search of food. Parents sometimes abandoned children when they could no longer feed them. In some regions, entire hamlets vanished from the map, swallowed not by war or fire, but by simple hunger. Yet even in the bleakest years, resilience emerged. Foraging became essential. People gathered nettles, sorrel, and wild herbs to make thin stews. Roots, acorns, and berries padded out meals. Fishing and hunting, though restricted by law, became lifelines for those near rivers and woods. Some communities formed collective agreements, sharing dwindling stores equally to prevent total collapse. The church, too, played a role, not only in almsgiving, but in framing famine as a spiritual trial. Priests preached that hunger was punishment for sin, a call to repentance. Fasts, once symbolic acts of devotion, blurred with involuntary starvation. In sermons and chronicles, famine became part of a divine narrative, human frailty laid bare. Before God, the memory of famine haunted medieval Europe. Villagers who had once lived through hunger carried its lessons forward, storing grain more carefully, planting hardier crops, and clinging to rituals meant to protect against scarcity. Waiting for bread was no longer simply an inconvenience. It was a reminder of how fragile survival truly was. Still, the question remains. Beyond hunger and substitutions, how did people rebuild after famine? What strategies, both practical and cultural, allowed medieval communities to recover and return to a life sustained once more by bread? When famine receded, it rarely vanished in a single harvest. Hunger left behind empty granaries, weakened bodies, and communities frayed by loss. The return of bread, the daily food that bound life together, was gradual, fragile, and uncertain. For medieval people, recovery from famine meant more than filling their bellies again. It meant rebuilding trust, reestablishing rhythms of work, and learning how to guard against the next shortage. The first step was always the harvest. After a famine year, every field mattered. Wheat, rye, and barley, when they ripened at last, promised more than food, they promised survival. Reaping became an almost sacred act, the culmination of months of hope. Yet even with a good harvest, scarcity lingered. Weakened livestock produced less milk, fewer eggs, and smaller litters. Families that had sold tools or seed grain to survive faced the challenge of farming without proper equipment or reserves. Recovery was rarely even. The wealthy often rebounded more quickly, while peasants and laborers bore scars for years. Communities adapted in small, practical ways. Some shifted to hardier grains like rye and oats, which could withstand poor weather better than wheat. Others built granaries designed to protect stores from damp and rodents. Village by village, lessons were carried forward. Save a little more. Plant a little differently. Trust less to chance. But famine was not only a matter of food, it was also a matter of culture and faith. The church continued to frame hunger as a spiritual trial. Yet the lived experience of scarcity often contradicted these explanations. Why, peasants asked, would the innocent starve while the wealthy survived? Such questions simmered beneath the surface, occasionally fueling resentment toward lords or monasteries seen as hoarding grain. Hunger, quiet though it often was, could erode the bonds of loyalty that tied medieval society together. Over time, memory itself became a form of protection. Families told stories of the bad years, passing down knowledge of how to forage, what to substitute, and when to tighten belts. Villages marked famines in their parish records, and chroniclers wove them into the history of kingdoms. Even when abundance returned, hunger was never forgotten. Bread, once taken for granted, carried new weight. To eat was to remember, to be aware that the loaf on the table was never guaranteed. In some regions, recovery inspired modest innovations. Crop rotation became more systematic. Watermills and windmills expanded, making flour more accessible. Local markets, disrupted by famine, slowly re-established trade networks that helped buffer against purely local shortages. These improvements did not eliminate hunger. Famines would return in later centuries, but they offered resilience. And yet, the shadow of famine never disappeared entirely. Every loaf baked after a hard year carried a lesson. Survival was precarious. A season of rain, a swarm of locusts, a sudden frost could undo months of careful labor. The return of abundance was always fragile. For medieval people, then, bread was never just food. It was hope, memory, and warning. To wait for bread was to confront the uncertainty of life itself, where nature, fortune, and human authority all held sway. And even when the loaf was finally baked and broken at the table, its presence reminded them of hunger's near necessity. So we are left to wonder if so much of medieval life was shaped not by feasts but by hunger. How differently might we understand history if we focus not on kings and battles, but on the long wait for bread? Story 4. Medieval heating. From hearth fires to braziers. When you picture a medieval home in winter, it is easy to imagine smoke curling upward, the glow of a fire against stone walls, and a family gathered close for warmth. Yet for most people, the reality was not so romantic. Heating in the Middle Ages was a matter of survival, and survival was rarely comfortable. The hearth, the open fire that sat at the center of daily life, was both a blessing and a burden. For peasants who made up the majority of Europe's population, the hearth often occupied the middle of a single-room dwelling. A shallow pit or raised stone base held burning logs, while the smoke found its way upward through a hole in the thatch roof, or in some cases, drifted out through cracks in the walls. There was no chimney to carry smoke neatly away. Instead, the air inside was thick with soot. Eyes watered, lungs ached, and clothing absorbed the sharp scent of wood smoke. But without fire, there was only cold, and cold could kill. The hearth served many purposes at once. It provided light in a world without electricity, warmth in a climate that could be bitter, and the steady heat required for cooking. Bread was baked, stews simmered, and milk was warmed at its edge. It was the center, not just of a house, but of a household's rhythms. Even tasks like drying herbs, curing meat, or softening wax for candles relied on its presence. The phrase, "keeping the home fires burning," was not a poetic metaphor, it was a literal truth. Yet the hearth was inefficient. Much of the heat escaped upward, leaving the far corners of a home chilly. Families huddled close, sleeping on benches or straw mats near the fire. During harsh winters, livestock were sometimes brought indoors, their body heat mingling with the warmth of the hearth. The arrangement was practical, if uncomfortable, and it blurred the line between domestic space and barnyard. Larger homes, belonging to lords, wealthy merchants, or monasteries, had bigger hearths but faced the same basic problem. Great halls often contained massive open fireplaces, but these too filled the air with smoke, blackening rafters and leaving walls dark with soot. A single blaze might warm those sitting close, yet people farther away still shivered. For this reason, gatherings often clustered near the fire, leaving empty space in the hall's shadows. The hearth also shaped social life. Its placement defined where people sat, how families gathered, and what kind of labor was possible during winter months. Women, who spent much of their time cooking, weaving, or tending children, lived in its heat and smoke more than anyone else. Children were warned not to stray too close, though accidents were common. Ashes, embers, and sparks were a daily hazard. Religion, too, acknowledged the hearth's importance. Fire was not only physical but spiritual, symbolizing purification, continuity, and divine light. Hearth fires were sometimes blessed, and festivals like Easter involved the lighting of new flames to mark renewal. In some villages, households extinguished their hearths at certain holy times, relighting them from a communal blaze, a ritual reminder that warmth and survival were shared. Still, despite its centrality, the hearth was never entirely secure. A stray ember could burn down a thatched cottage. A fire starved of wood might die in the night, leaving a household to wake to freezing air. The constant tending of flames was a reminder of life's fragility. Heat was precious, fleeting, and never guaranteed. The hearth, then, was both comfort and struggle. It gathered people together, even as it filled their lungs with smoke. It promised survival, but never luxury. It was the heart of medieval life, beating with warmth and flame, but always on the edge of going out. And so we might ask, in a world where survival depended so heavily on such an imperfect source of heat, how did medieval people begin to seek alternatives to the smoky central hearth? As medieval life moved forward, the hearth remained central, but innovations gradually transformed how people managed warmth. By the 12th and 13th centuries, wealthier households began to experiment with designs that changed not only heating but the very architecture of buildings. The invention and spread of the chimney was one of the most important shifts in medieval domestic life, though it was slow to take root. The chimney, in its simplest form, created a controlled passage for smoke to escape, instead of drifting through a hole in the roof or settling into rafters. It traveled upward through a constructed flue. This allowed fires to be placed against walls rather than in the center of the room, freeing space and reducing smoke indoors. But chimneys were expensive to build and maintain. Masonry work was costly, and repairs were frequent. For peasants, the idea of a chimney was nearly unthinkable. Most lived with smoky hearths well into the late Middle Ages. Those who could afford chimneys found that they reshaped the experience of daily life. With smoke funneled out, upper rooms became habitable in a new way. Before chimneys, second stories were often dark, stuffy spaces used mainly for storage. Now they could serve as bedrooms, studies, or private chambers. The architecture of castles and manor houses began to reflect this change, with individual fireplaces warming different rooms. Heating was still uneven, but no longer restricted to a single smoky hall. Even before chimneys became common, another solution circulated: the brazier. A brazier was a portable container, often metal, filled with burning charcoal. Unlike an open fire, it could be moved, placed under a table, or carried to another part of the house. In southern Europe, where winters were milder, braziers became especially popular. People draped heavy cloths over tables, letting warmth gather beneath while feet and legs were kept cozy. Yet braziers carried dangers of their own. Poor ventilation could lead to suffocation, as charcoal released deadly carbon monoxide. Stories survive of entire families found lifeless after a night beside a brazier in a closed room. Castles, monasteries, and towns adopted different solutions depending on resources. In monasteries, where silence and study were valued, warming rooms, special chambers, kept heated for comfort, offered monks a place to gather during cold months. Scriptoria, where manuscripts were copied, often featured braziers to keep hands from freezing. Yet despite these attempts, cold remained a constant obstacle to daily labor. Monks wrote of ink freezing in winter, of candles sputtering in icy drafts, of numb fingers slowing their work. Urban households developed another layer of adaptation. In crowded towns, where fire posed a constant threat, regulations sometimes limited how fires could be managed. Stone chimneys became a requirement in some cities to reduce the risk of catastrophic blazes. At the same time, guilds of masons and builders profited from constructing elaborate fireplaces, decorating them with carved stone, coats of arms, and heraldic animals. Fireplaces were no longer only practical, they became symbols of wealth and stability. Meanwhile, in the countryside, peasants relied on older methods. Turf, peat, and dried dung supplemented scarce firewood. Families learned to ration fuel carefully, often keeping fires small and letting coals smolder through the night. In harsh winters, survival meant choosing between warmth and conserving resources. The brazier and chimney remained distant luxuries, glimpsed perhaps in a lord's hall or a town tavern, but rarely part of village life. The transformation of heating technology was gradual, uneven, and shaped by social class. What united all medieval people, however, was the struggle against cold. Whether huddled by a smoky hearth, gathered under a brazier-warmed table, or seated in a chamber with a carved fireplace, the presence of heat defined daily rhythms. Yet, it was never enough. Cold seeped into stone walls, through cracks in timber, across damp floors. Winter was a season of endurance, measured not in comfort, but in survival. And so the question lingers, even with chimneys and braziers offering new ways to fight the cold. What larger lessons did medieval society draw from its endless struggle with heat and fire? By the later Middle Ages, fire was no longer merely a flickering necessity in the center of a smoky hall. It had become a force woven into the identity of homes, towns, and entire societies. Yet, despite improvements in chimneys, fireplaces, and braziers, the experience of warmth remained fragile. Survival through the cold was never guaranteed, and the rhythm of life reflected this dependence on fire. For most people, the daily tending of fire was a task as important as preparing food. Women and children were often charged with keeping embers alive, ensuring that flames never fully died. Matches, as we know them, did not exist. Flint, steel, and tinder could spark a new fire, but the process was slow and uncertain. To let the hearth go cold was to invite hardship, especially in winter. Embers were sometimes carried between neighbors in pots, lending fire as one might lend flour or grain. This communal exchange of heat revealed not only practical need, but also the ways in which warmth was shared, binding households together in unseen networks of survival. In wealthier homes, fireplaces became a canvas for social display. Tapestries hung above mantels, heraldic designs were carved into stone, and elaborate chimneys towered above rooftops, signaling prestige. Yet these grand displays masked a simple truth. Even in castles, warmth was scarce. Great halls were drafty, with heat rising to rafters rather than lingering at floor level. Guests and lords alike wrapped themselves in cloaks and furs, the fire as much a spectacle as a source of comfort. Servants clustered close to the flames, while those seated farther away shivered, regardless of the wealth that surrounded them. The reliance on fire also came with risk. Town records across Europe recount devastating blazes, whole streets reduced to ash, markets destroyed, churches consumed in flames. A single stray spark from a hearth could undo years of labor. The paradox of medieval heating was that the very element meant to protect against cold could, in an instant, bring ruin. This duality shaped urban planning, spurred new regulations, and left a mark on memory. Communities rebuilt again and again, always wary, always needing the fire they could not abandon. Monastic life offers a window into the balance between endurance and adaptation. Monks followed strict routines of prayer, fasting, and work, yet even they made allowances for the cold. Cloisters were often left unheated, but special warming rooms were maintained for relief. These spaces became quiet sanctuaries where cold hands thawed, conversation softened, and the otherwise austere rhythm of monastic existence allowed a moment of reprieve. Warmth, however fleeting, was acknowledged as essential to both body and spirit. Thick clothing, animal companionship inside homes, and the constant presence of smoke defined winter living. generations grew up accustomed to discomfort. The smell of smoke clung to hair, skin, and walls. The sting of cold was a familiar companion. Survival meant resilience, not luxury. In many ways, the endurance of medieval people in the face of relentless winters is as remarkable as any grand battle or political event by the end of the Middle Ages. Heating methods laid foundations for what would come next. Chimneys became standard in many regions, reshaping architecture and allowing more complex domestic life. Fireplaces multiplied, spreading into bedrooms and private studies. Braziers endured in warmer climates, influencing household traditions well into the early modern period. The medieval struggle with cold did not end, but it transformed into a new relationship with warmth, one where fire was not just survival, but a defining feature of home. Looking back, the history of medieval heating may appear mundane compared to tales of kings and crusades, yet it shaped lives just as deeply. The ways people built, slept, worked, and even imagined comfort were rooted in how they managed fire. Without it, manuscripts would not have been copied, meals would not have been cooked, families would not have endured long winters. The history of heating is, in its quiet persistence, the history of survival itself. And so, as we consider this long struggle against the cold, a question remains: how did the simple act of tending a fire, humble, repetitive, often overlooked, help shape the resilience of an entire civilization? Story 5. Sickness on the trail. Ordinary illness, extraordinary loss in the American West. It is easy to imagine covered wagons creaking across vast prairies, oxen trudging through dust, and families gazing toward horizons of promise. The story is often framed as one of adventure, discovery, and settlement. But beneath the romance of westward expansion lay an often ignored truth. Illness and disease were as constant as the sun overhead, and for many they were more dangerous than the rugged landscapes or hostile encounters along the way. The trails, west the Oregon, the Santa Fe, the California, were not just roads of opportunity, they were corridors of sickness. The sheer scale of human movement, thousands upon thousands traveling with limited sanitation, created conditions ripe for disease. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid, fever, and measles spread like shadows, claiming lives with brutal efficiency. Travelers recorded in journals the sound of coughing at night, the stench of waste near campgrounds, and the quiet grief of burying loved ones along the trail. One of the most feared illnesses was cholera. In the 1840s and 1850s, epidemic waves swept across the United States, striking port towns and inland villages alike. When wagon trains carried settlers west, they carried cholera caused by contaminated water. The disease could kill within hours, draining the body through violent dehydration. Families often had little choice but to camp near rivers or streams, drawing water that might already be infected. Sometimes entire groups would fall ill within days. Graves appeared along riversides, marked with wooden crosses or not marked at all, quickly overtaken by grass. Yet cholera was only one enemy. Dysentery, a catch-all term for severe intestinal sickness, struck even more frequently. Poor food storage, spoiled meat, or simply the constant presence of flies around camps spread the illness easily. Diaries often mention the flux, a relentless, exhausting sickness that sapped strength from the young and old alike. Unlike cholera, it often lingered, leaving the ill bedridden in wagons or too weak to walk. This slowed entire groups, creating tension as healthier travelers debated whether to press on or remain behind for children. Measles was another silent killer. On the trail, an outbreak could sweep through a wagon train in days. With limited shelter, families had little ability to isolate the sick. Coughing, rashes, and fevers spread from child to child, often claiming lives before parents could even grasp what was happening. Survivors carried the memory of tiny graves along the trail, reminders that even in the pursuit of a better future, the fragility of life was never far away. Typhoid fever added yet another layer of danger. Spread through contaminated water, it caused prolonged fever, weakness, and delirium. In close quarters, with wagons clustered together and sanitary practices minimal, the disease spread quickly. At times, illness dictated the pace of travel. More than terrain or weather, entire trains of wagons slowed to a crawl, each mile marked not by progress but by the strain of caring for the sick. Beyond the well-known diseases, the simple hardships of the trail could make even minor ailments deadly. A cut on the hand from repairing a wheel might fester into infection. Smoke from nightly campfires irritated lungs, worsening coughs that could turn into pneumonia. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Pregnant women, already vulnerable, faced increased dangers from complications that had little chance of medical care. Even a toothache, untreated, could become a source of life-threatening infection to modern eyes. It may seem astonishing that so much sickness went untreated, but frontier medicine was limited to what could be carried in small boxes and bottles. Doctors were rare on the trail. Most families relied on home remedies, herbal teas, whiskey, vinegar, or camphor. Some carried packets of calomel, a mercury-based powder thought to purge sickness, though it often poisoned the patient as much as it helped. Others trusted patent medicines, advertised in newspapers as miracle cures, but often little more than alcohol mixed with herbs. At best, these offered comfort. At worst, they hastened decline. Journals and letters reveal the human cost in unvarnished detail. One emigrant described watching neighbors fall ill with cholera, writing, "We buried 3 yesterday. They were well in the morning, gone by night." Another recorded the strain of tending sick children while still needing to hitch oxen and press forward. These testimonies remind us that sickness on the trail was not an abstract threat, but a daily weight carried in every creak of the wagon and every restless night by the campfire. And yet, people endured. For every grave dug along the road, there were others who pressed forward, weakened but determined. Families bound themselves to the journey with resilience, even as illness cut deep into their ranks. The constant presence of sickness did not stop the migration, but it shaped its lowing some, breaking others, and etching sorrow into the history of the American West. As we consider the journey westward, one question lingers. When the land itself was harsh enough, how did people find the strength to keep moving forward in the face of invisible enemies that struck without warning? If illness was an ever-present shadow on the emigrant trail, then coping with it became a daily act of survival. The sheer variety of sicknesses that struck travelers, cholera, dysentery, measles, typhoid, pneumonia, meant that every family had to prepare in some way for medical care, even if that preparation was based more on hope than certainty. In many ways, the story of sickness on the trail is less about the diseases themselves and more about the ingenuity, desperation, and persistence with which ordinary people responded. The most basic defense was knowledge, though what people knew about disease in the mid-19th century was often a mixture of tradition, guesswork, and flawed science. Germ theory was still in its infancy. Most settlers did not understand the true causes of disease. Cholera, for example, was widely believed to spread through bad air or miasmas rather than contaminated water. As a result, many wagon trains avoided camping near stagnant pools, not because of bacterial awareness, but because of an instinctive distrust of foul odors. This misunderstanding did not prevent sickness, but it shaped how people behaved. Families often carried small medicine chests, packed with remedies recommended by newspapers, doctors, or word of mouth. Calomel, as mentioned earlier, was a common treatment. Its mercury content, believed to cleanse the body through purging. Opium-based tinctures such as laudanum were also popular, used to dull pain, quiet persistent coughs, or soothe restless children. While these medicines offered relief, they carried dangers, overdoses, addiction, and unintended poisoning. Yet, in an era when the alternative was to do nothing, families leaned heavily on whatever cures they had at hand. Beyond commercial medicines, settlers turned to herbal and folk remedies, many drawn from both European traditions and indigenous knowledge. Peppermint tea was brewed for stomach complaints. Willow bark, rich in salicin, provided relief for fever and pain, an early precursor to aspirin. Garlic, onions, and vinegar were believed to fight infection. Even whiskey, in large supply among some trains, was used as a disinfectant, anesthetic, or simply as a way to numb suffering. These practices reveal a deep human need, not only to act against illness, but to feel that something, anything, was being done. The burden of care fell heavily on women. While men often focused on driving wagons, repairing equipment, or scouting routes, women tended to the sick. They sat through long nights, cooling fevers with damp cloths, feeding weakened family members, and burying children or husbands when efforts failed. Journals frequently record mothers as both caretakers and mourners, their hands red from washing linens fouled by sickness, their resolve tested by loss. Their work was invisible to history in many ways, but without it, survival rates would have been far worse. Children also played roles in caregiving. Older siblings fetched water, gathered herbs, or watched over younger ones, so that parents could tend to the gravely ill. These small acts of care bound families together, even as they traveled through landscapes that felt endlessly indifferent to their suffering. At times, wagon trains employed or encountered physicians, but these were rare and often stretched beyond their abilities. A doctor might join a train seeking opportunity in the West, charging for his services along the way. But medical knowledge was limited. A physician might recommend bleeding a fevered patient or prescribing massive doses of purgatives, practices now recognized as harmful. Still, the presence of someone with even a modicum of medical training provided comfort, and often comfort itself was a form of healing. Sanitation was a constant challenge. The crowded conditions of camps wagons circled tightly. Families sharing limited space created perfect breeding grounds for disease. Waste disposal was haphazard at best. Some trains established rules, designating latrine areas far from water sources, but not all followed them consistently. Flies swarmed over food and waste alike, spreading illness invisibly. Those who did manage to enforce stricter sanitation likely saw lower sickness rates, though such records are hard to measure precisely. Food and water were other key factors. Spoiled provisions could trigger dysentery, while contaminated rivers carried cholera and typhoid. Boiling water was sometimes recommended, but firewood was precious, and the labor of constant boiling was not always practical. Families had to weigh the effort against the risk, often gambling with their health. For many, the very act of drinking was a leap of faith. When death camioned, it did. With grim regularitith, rituals of mourning were brief. Time was always pressing. Graves were dug quickly, often shallow, sometimes lined with rocks to deter animals. Families might pause for a hymn or prayer, but soon the wagons rolled on. Some emigrants recorded the haunting sight of graves every mile or two along popular trails, each marked by simple wood or stone, each telling the silent story of sickness that cut short the promise of a new life. The psychological toll of sickness was immense. Beyond physical suffering, emigrants lived with constant anxiety, wondering who might fall ill next, whether their family could endure, or if the journey itself had been a fatal mistake. Yet, their writings, there is also evidence of remarkable resilience. Many settlers accepted illness as part of the journey, a cost paid for the possibility of land and opportunity in the West. They balanced sorrow with determination, pressing forward even as grief weighed heavily on their hearts. This raises a deeper question. In an environment where medicine was so uncertain and disease so relentless, what sustained people's hope and will to continue, even as the trail became a landscape of graves? By the time wagon trains reached their destinations, whether the fertile valleys of Oregon, the mining towns of California, or the open ranges of Utah had already left its mark. Families arrived, diminished in number, altered in spirit, and seasoned by experiences they never could have imagined when they first set out. Sickness was not an interruption to the westward journey. It was one of its defining features. The final months of travel were often the hardest. Supplies were low. Fatigue was crushing, and seasonal changes brought new threats. Summer heat bred fevers and dysentery, while early autumn rains chilled wagons and made pneumonia more common. By this point, settlers knew too well how fragile their health could be. A simple cough was no longer dismissed lightly. It could signal something that might sweep through a whole train. Families that had already buried loved ones walked on with a kind of weary acceptance, knowing the trail itself claimed lives as part of its toll. Yet, for those who survived, sickness left behind more than scars. It left knowledge. Emigrants carried forward practical lessons about disease prevention, however incomplete those lessons were. Many families learned to be cautious about water sources, to cook food thoroughly, and to keep campsites as clean as possible. Though their understanding of germs was absent, their lived experience created habits that sometimes offered real protection. In a quiet way, the trail became a school of health, teaching thousands of ordinary people how to adapt when professional medicine was far out of reach. The legacies of trail sickness also show up in the communities that emerged in the West. once settled emigrants often prioritized access to clean water and proximity to doctors when possible. Small towns founded along trails sometimes began with makeshift hospitals, or at least designated caretakers who remembered what it meant to face epidemics without help. Families that had lost children or parents to disease carried those memories into how they built their lives, valuing resilience, practicality, and sometimes a stoic approach to suffering. What is striking is how rarely the history of westward migration dwells on illness. Schoolbook accounts tell of pioneers braving rivers, scaling mountains, or defending against attacks. Yet the far greater enemy was often invisible microbes carried in water, food, and air. The thousands of graves along the Oregon, Mormon, and California trails are silent testimony to this fact. For every dramatic crossing of the Platte River or wagon accident remembered in memoirs, there were countless ordinary deaths from diarrhea, fever, or dehydration that quietly reshaped family destinies. Sickness also blurred the line between individual and communal survival. A family struck by cholera could infect neighbors, yet at the same time, those neighbors might be the only ones able to help. Wagon trains were forced to balance fear of contagion with the necessity of compassion. In some cases, trains abandoned sick families rather than risk infection. In others, they stayed behind, tending the ill even at their own peril. These decisions reveal the complicated moral landscape of the trail, where survival instincts clashed with empathy. For children who survived, memories of sickness often stayed vivid throughout their lives. Later interviews with pioneers reveal recollections of watching siblings weaken, of walking past fresh graves, of hearing the endless coughs at night. Some looked back with bitterness, others with resignation, but nearly all recognized that their childhoods were marked by the trail's constant brush with death. The story of sickness on the trail is ultimately a story of ordinary people facing extraordinary vulnerability. They had no hospitals, no modern antibiotics, no reliable doctors. What they had was each other, their resourcefulness, and their willingness to endure. The fact that so many reached the West at all is a testament not only to physical stamina, but also to the strength of families and communities who shouldered the burden of care. And yet, one can't help but wonder, how different would the American West have been if medical knowledge had been just a little more advanced, if cholera had been prevented by cleaner water, if smallpox vaccination had been universal, if pneumonia could be treated effectively. How many more families would have arrived whole? How many children would have grown into adults? How many graves would never have been dug along the trail? This reflection lingers because it reminds us of something humbling. The history of expansion and settlement is as much a history of illness as it is of ambition. For every pioneer who planted new fields, there were others whose lives ended in fever tents or shallow graves. And while their names are mostly lost, their silent struggles shaped the reality of westward migration. The West was not only built on dreams of land and fortune, it was also built on the resilience of those who bore sickness, loss, and grief, and yet pressed on. As you picture the long wagon trains fading into the horizon, imagine the unseen burden. They carried not just wagons of supplies and hopes for tomorrow, but also the weight of illness, the sound of coughing in the night, and the memory of graves left behind. And so the question remains, when we think of great journeys in history, Should we measure them by the distance traveled, or by the resilience shown in the quiet, often painful struggles that so few remember? You've been listening to Boring Pastimes, where history lingers in the details and the forgotten finds its voice. May the quiet stories of those who came before bring you rest, reflection, and perhaps a gentler way of looking at the world. Until next time, good night.